G'day everyone, I'm the man called Kemosabe. I'll be the man with the plan from the land down under, and this video is a look at the 10 rules I follow and apply when I'm writing. This list isn't exhaustive, and nor am I saying that they will or should work for everyone. These are just delineations I apply when I'm writing, and like most creative processes, I'm happy to break them completely when the time is right. Most of these rules have been discovered in how-to writing books through online discussion or reading interviews of accomplished authors. I don't think I would ever claim even a single one of them is wholly my own, and I am sure you'll see several of them in other videos online. These rules are mostly compiled for working in prose, as scripting comics has its own conventions and necessities, but there will be some overlap. In no particular order then are all the rules I could think of that matter to my writing while I was sitting next to my wife watching season 4 of Bosch. I've never read the books, but I really like the show. Rule number 1, show, don't tell. First off the bat, we have a rule made to be broken. You hear this a lot, and with good reason. It should be the standard lens you view your work through to avoid some of the problems mentioned in other rules below. Show don't tell is the difference between presenting descriptive elements, the look on someone's face, their posture, the tone of their words, the way they interact with others, versus just writing, Joe was angry. If you have to tell your audience something that fundamental is happening with a character, you've got a problem with your writing. When you tell the audience something, you're telling them how to think. When you show them something is happening, you give them the opportunity to work it out themselves. You create an expectation in their mind, and then that expectation is met. This rule doesn't always work in dialogue. People tell when they are talking. Naturally, people who are talking are going to tell, not show, when speaking to others. So why did I say this rule was made to be broken? Because, especially in first-person writing, if you show everything that happens, your 100k word book blows up into 300k. There are times, again especially in first-person stories, where Joe was angry is perfect for the story. How about something simple like I opened the door and got in? How do you show that without telling the reader that the character opened the door and got in the car? Show don't tell isn't a catch-all. It doesn't apply to every situation, especially verbs or actions. Joe's hands clenched, his voice quivered when he spoke. He was hunched over and his face screwed up when he looked at me. I hate you, Harry. I wish you had died instead. That shows you that Joe's angry. The problem with show don't tell is if that is all you do, even a single short scene becomes blown out into a 100-page sprawl. You need some directness of action. You need to be succinct, and depending on your chosen genre, it's a necessity. If your showing becomes so flowery and verbose that you lose the reader, you've failed as a writer. Rule number 2, minimize adverbs. Some authors will insist that you banish all adverbs altogether. This isn't a bad standard. If you set out to banish all adverbs and you leave in, say, 10% of the ones you had, you might end up with a tolerable amount. Most adverbs are unnecessary. Early on in your writing, you will think that you want them there, and this kind of conditioning can take a while to break, but your work is usually better off without them. Adverbs are those wishy-washy words that tend to end with ly. They are weak words that try to tell the reader what, as a writer, you should be showing. Don't tell me that the character said angrily. Show me that he growled or used his body language to indicate his state of mind or the context he said it in or the sharpness of the dialogue. Every adverb used is a wasted chance to use an adjective. Adjectives show, adverbs tell. Rule number 3, use strong, full language. I see a lot of this sort of thing in fan writing, fan fiction, or in the work of new and inexperienced writers. They couch their descriptions in weak, half-hearted language. They don't want to call their MC's hair long because they're afraid people will think their tough guy lone wolf alpha rebel is rocking some Rapunzel action, but they do want to make a point that he has a lustrous lion's mane spouting from his grimacing skull. So what does a novice writer do? He writes, Wolf ran his fingers through his somewhat long hair. That is weak, uncommitted language. Commit to the bit. Call his hair long if it's long. If you want to be specific, reference it to something else. Call it shoulder length if you have to. But ditch that kind of wishy-washy language that holds your prose back from being any one thing. To these burgeoning writers, colours are reddish purple instead of red purple or just purple. They use words like predominantly and eventually and slightly and rather and although and nearly and mostly and phrases like he was X yet Y. Halfway words that mitigate the commitment to anything being wholly a thing. So afraid of failure, these writers can't even designate a colour without trying to assuage red from being red. They're overthinking it, bloating their writing with unnecessary adverbs, there it is again, and overall weakening whatever flow their writing might actually have. Rule number 4, use the correct point of view for your story. For gritty, seamy, street-level fiction, I'll often use a first-person point of view. Hearing the descriptions and recounting of events directly from the character's mouth allows for an unprecedented level of introspection and character study. You can achieve similar results with a third-person point of view that uses like an omniscient style of narrating, and while I'm a fan of that, it's probably my second most used point of view type. It's still a poor man's first person. There are times where you'll not want to go with the first person, however. Maybe you have a story that has more than one main character. Maybe the point of view will shift from chapter to chapter. You might do that thing that Stephen King does sometimes, where he'll jump into someone's head for a short chapter, detail the life and times of some poor down-on-his-luck schlub who recounts his hard-luck story to us right before he's killed by the menace of the book or crashes into the protagonist, setting off a new trail of events. Some authors have reported great success in writing and marketing their books after changing point of view. A.B. Patterson, author of the Harry Kenmare series, mentioned in his latest collection that writing Kenmare from a first-person point of view was hugely freeing and made everything click for him. When a character has a really strong personality, a really distinct voice, it behooves you to capitalise on that by writing from that first-person point of view. On the other hand, the first Jack Reacher book I ever read was oddly written in a first-person point of view, and I hated it. Reacher is an enigmatic, practical being, more a force of nature than a mortal man. When I reread the book years later in a third-person point of view, I loved it, and subsequently have bought and read every single one of them. Reacher's aloof superhumanity rang true in a third-person point of view. It's hard to see someone as the good guy version of the Terminator when they roll their very normal, very mundane thoughts around their very human skull. If Reacher was to wax lyrical about his actions and his strong sense of right and wrong, he'd sound like he was sermonizing. He'd be posturing, a puff-chested PSA or one of those morality stingers at the end of a He-Man or G.I. Joe cartoon. For a character like Reacher, you need that detachment. Third-person point of view is his Olympus. It separates him from the mere mortals. It frames him as more than mortal. Conversely, someone detailing Harry Kenmare's deeds via a third-person point of view might be seen to be either advocating for or judging his deeds. Better he speak directly to his actions and motivations himself, especially when the character is such a cad. Spend some time thinking about what point of view suits the story. The grittier, grimier, and more personal the story is, the more reason you have to use the first-person point of view. When you're writing harsh, crippling violence or visceral animal sex, doing it from a third-person perspective seems voyeuristic and uncomfortable, unless it's the effect you're after, in which case, right away. Rule number 5, use the correct tense for your story. I dislike reading a story in the present tense. It seems less professional, less polished, and less masterful than using the past tense. Steve opens the door and nods. Layla enters the room and sits. She draws a cigarette from a case and lights it. These sound like stage directions, not a flowing narrative. However, present tense can inject immediacy and a sense of panic or being time poor into a scene. Some writers switch between present and past tense for effect, usually between chapters, but I think American Psycho did it mid-scene near the end of the book. Present tense can make things seem more exciting, more action-packed and in your face, but it also adds a sense of immediacy to slower scenes, which doesn't suit the pace of these pieces of writing. I recently wrote a 10,000-word short story while on holiday. I had a germ of an idea, a tablet, and some time to spare. I'd just finished reading White Jazz by James Ellroy. The book is written in first-person present tense, and it has a frenetic, sloppy, in-your-face pace that makes it exhausting to read. These are all good things, by the way. Sloppy complements the story. The gradual way control begins to elude the main character, the lengths he takes to keep his head above water. It's classic Ellroy. I wanted to write something with that immediacy and the overwhelming grittiness and rawness of White Jazz. Without even thinking about it, when I began to write the story, it came out in present tense. My wife commented later when she read the final draft that the story was scary. It was too real. She said that it was confronting because she felt like she was right there with the character as he was perpetrating violence and violent people. You can't ask for a better review than that. Present tense made that story work where past tense maybe wouldn't have. This might be one of those frustrating things where the more you write and read, the better you are able to judge the best use of tense. If you're unsure, try a chapter, page, or even a paragraph in both present and past tense and see what works best for you. Even Lee Child changed his mind about this at one point. Rule number 6, eliminate semicolons. They clutter up dialogue, they make the text look technical. No one uses a semicolon when they talk. You can't see them in real life. You don't want to see them on the page either. Most semicolon instances can be rewritten as 2 shorter sentences, and while a variety of sentence length is what makes prose into poetry to the ear, shorter sentences are generally better for accommodating a broad variety of readers. Rule number 7, minimize physical descriptions of characters. For the most part, it's better to let the readers form their own image of what the character looks like. Have you ever formed an image of a character that was contrary to the described view or the image on the cover? I do it constantly. I saw Sean Bean as Sharp before I ever read any of the books. Every time Cornwell referred to Sharp as dark-haired, it threw me. It pulled me from the story. And as we've talked about before, that is the absolute last thing we ever want to do as writers. When I was in high school, a few decades ago, I was reading The Ninja by Eric Van Lusbader. My English teacher at the time was a jacked footy player who loved poetry. Despite Nick Linear being described as biracial, for whatever reason, I associated him visually with Mr. Roberts. No matter how many of these books I read, I always saw Nick looking like the English teacher. Your readers will get an image in their head and almost nothing you can do will change it. Do you think anyone who watched the Lord of the Rings movies before reading the books will ever see anyone but Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn? It doesn't matter. Why would you want to change your reader's mind? Why is it so important that the reader sees the character the way you do? Unless some physical feature is relevant to the progression of the story, it's not really relevant. If you insist it is, maybe consider that you have an unhealthy interest in the appearance of yourself, your completely original character. What matters more, that you enjoy the story exactly as intended, or that the reader enjoys it? Check your priorities. You can beat the reader over the head with physical descriptions until they have exactly the same sort of image in their head as you do, but I doubt they'll be back for another one of your books. What matters more, your character's eye colour being known, or repeat business? Rule number 8. Imply where you can. Don't go in for big exposition dumps. Even in exposition dumps, a particular bear of detective fiction I'm finding out, there is scope to imply information rather than have it spelled out explicitly. Imply, and leave things vague sometimes. This builds the audience's desire to want to know more. I call it Perry Mason language after a mention in J. Scott Bell's How to Write Pulp Fiction. He described how the kind of dialogue where people in conversations explain things they both already know for the reader's benefit, or in this case the viewer's benefit, was a common occurrence on classic episodes of Perry Mason. I grew up watching black and white episodes of Raymond Barr's Perry Mason, so this name for it stuck. Bell gives some examples, but they all come down to instances where the character in a conversation says something out loud that both people in the conversation already know. Don't do this. Write the conversation naturally, have the characters imply what's really going on through their words, and give your audience a little credit. They're smarter than you think. Rule number 9. Make your story as easy to read as possible. In general, shorter sentences are best when writing. Of course there are exceptions. Prose needs to have some poetry after all, and instances of horror or elation or confusion lend themselves to run-on sentences and abnormal formatting, but they are exceptions to the rule. Shorter sentences accommodate a wider variety of readers. Unless you're writing literary fiction, aka fiction that don't sell good, you want to reduce the reading level of your prose as far as possible. Hemingway app has a bunch of great features, but the two I like best is that it identifies and color codes sentences that are too long or difficult to read, and it assesses the reading level needed to comprehend your story. I believe the number it gives is the grade school reading level needed to understand your text. Someone correct me if I'm wrong about that. Most of my books sit at around grade 3 or 4. That's not a bad thing. You want your writing to be as accessible as possible, if you're writing to make money and not to be a literary snob. Rule number 10 is to use an active voice rather than a passive voice. This is one of those things that I just do automatically in my writing. I've spent years writing both academically and in a literary format, so I feel I can switch between the two easily. If you don't know the difference between active and passive voice and why it matters, active voice is when the subject of the sentence does something, and passive is when something is done to the subject of the sentence. For fiction, particularly genre fiction, you want to be writing in the active voice. It's more impactful, more immediate, and more direct. It makes your work leaner and more accessible. John shot him is an example of an active voice. John, being the subject of the sentence, shot him. He was shot by John is an example of passive voice. He is the subject of the sentence and something happened to him. Passive voice is often used in periodicals, reports, articles, and other non-fiction texts. It has its place, but the formal, regimented, and proper way of conveying information bogs down the flow of your work, bloats the word count, and makes the work harder to read and comprehend by some audiences. Again, rules are made to be broken. Someone in dialogue might use passive often because they are smart or want to look smart, but in actions and descriptions is unnecessary and elitist. Do you want to sound smart or do you want to make money? The two aren't mutually exclusive, but if you favour the former over the latter, maybe consider a career in literary fiction. So that's my list of rules for writing. When something goes awry in a script, I can cast my mind over these fundamental factors, maybe come up with a reason why I've gone astray. What rules do you consider necessary? Are there any that are important that you think I've missed? Are there any that you disagree with? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I hope you join me for the next video. Take care.